Over the last few months, I've been approached several times about the subject of death, including a tag by the wonderful Largo 64 and the glorious Rosebush, inquiries about psychological studies, assertions that I'm pro-mortality, questions about my responses to some thought-terminating cliches, and about my personal outlook. I've always been fascinated by how we cope with death, or more interestingly, how we fail to cope with it, with all the destructive consequences those failures bring. It's also had some personal resonance for me recently. It feels the right time to share that I started experiencing throat problems a few months ago that wouldn't go away. When I reported the symptoms, the doctors immediately suspected an aggressive type of cancer that one of my brothers died of, and I was rushed through a series of tests. I recently received the results of those tests. My condition is benign. Given this temporary stay of execution, I thought I'd address all of these solicitations in 2 videos dedicated to death. But before I begin, I'd like to invite you to take a moment to consider your personal reaction to these videos about death. Your reactions as you watched them, and also before you started watching, when you saw they were available. What were the thoughts and feelings that came up for you? Were they positive, negative, mixed, blank? I'd invite you to hold these responses in mind and, if it feels okay, perhaps share some of them. We have a lot to deal with in this experience we call life, don't we? On the most basic level, we're faced with the physical challenges of survival, finding and competing for food, water, shelter, and if we're so inclined, sexual partners, while distancing ourselves from diseases, parasites, predators, natural disasters. On the social level, we find ourselves within a species containing huge variation. We must determine the significance of these differences, if indeed there is any, and find our own place within this variety. On the psychological level, we wrestle with all kinds of unknowns, unpredictabilities, ambiguities, dissonances. We live with swathes of unanswered questions, questions about the universe we find around us, and the one we find inside us, our own mind, with so many of its processes blocked out of our awareness. Perhaps the most profound paradox we experience comes when we bring the universe and the mind together, as the meaningless meets the meaning-hungry. Within that paradox, the task we seem to find most intimidating of all is the business of confronting death. We can infer that level of intimidation by the extreme lengths we employ to deny death. Extreme protective lengths, employing a range of physical and psychological barriers to block the fear out, and extreme aggressive lengths, dehumanizing, attacking, and killing those who face us with our fears. We witness and experience all kinds of disproportionate emotional responses in life. An example familiar to us all is phobias. For the phobic individual, there's a sizable mismatch between the perceived and actual levels of threat associated with the phobic object or situation. As a child, I was arachnophobic. I ascribed a quasi-human intelligence to the spider's stealthy behavior, and imagined that its goal was to get into my mouth. I never questioned why it might want to do that. But that's the self-preserving nature of fear. It facilitates irrational fantasies and pseudo-explanations that maintain the fear, while simultaneously diminishing our capacity for the kinds of rational processing that might break its hold. One of the saving graces of phobias is that they're generally owned by the individual. As that arachnophobic child, I didn't go around thinking everyone else was wrong not to have a spider phobia. I knew the problem was mine, but there are other kinds of disproportionate emotional responses where ownership of one's own fears aren't so easily accepted. As a child coming up to 14, about to announce my departure from the religion into which I'd been indoctrinated, I actually expected a positive reaction. Having spent months in private thought trying to justify my belief in that religion, it dawned on me. Every magical being so far had been hoaxes played by the adults. I kicked myself for spending so much time working through the arguments, and I looked forward to having a laugh with the adults when they found out I'd seen through this religion hoax too. My announcement of non-belief was greeted with rage, contempt, and punishment. When the fatwa was declared on Salman Rushdie in 1989, I initially dismissed it as a prank, appealing to worldwide followers to implement a death sentence just for writing a novel. I'd never heard anything so pathetic and ridiculous. But Khomeini's decree was genuine. Such homicidal theocracies actually existed. 10 years ago, a Muslim friend of mine shared that her nephew had come out to her as a homosexual. She told me that if their family found out, he'd be taken to India and buried alive. Furthermore, if her family found out that she knew and hadn't told them, the same would happen to her. 5 years ago, when I first heard of the anti-atheist hate widely promulgated across the US, I thought it had to be some big national joke, some trendy, ironic faux prejudice. When I realized it was serious, I joined the discourse. My focus back then was purely on the prejudicial aspects, rather than debating the existence of gods. But in response to simply revealing my atheism, I received death wishes, death threats, suggestions that I was already dead, spiritually, and of course, salivating references to my perpetual living death in hell. Talk about overkill. But I recognized some of my own stuff here too. At age 12, when I was an active Christian, a religious education teacher asked me why I believed what I believed. The question seemed innocuous enough at first, but as I reflected on it, I realized nothing valid was coming to mind. An appropriate response would have been to simply admit that. My actual response? I wanted that teacher wiped from the face of the planet. What drives these extreme reactions? What's the big deal? Were the believers here any less free to believe whatever they wanted? Divine beliefs are generally claimed to bring inner peace. But what kind of inner peace is it that demands that other people get their inner peace the same way? Or else? Clearly, in each of these cases, with such hyper-aggressive defenses being mobilized, the aggressor was protecting something tremendously fragile. Emerging out of the cocoon of religion, the big deal for me was death. Realizing that there was no reason whatsoever to believe I'd be reborn, reincarnated, resurrected, or reconstituted in any way after my physical demise, let alone reunited with loved ones in some sugary hereafter. It quickly occurred to me that this was, of course, the prime psychological function of the part of our culture we label religion. To deny death. To reject the unthinkable thought that when our brains stop, we stop. We have a host of other cultural props and mechanisms explicitly designed to help us deal with the passing of friends and family. Ceremonies where we can share our feelings. Professional services to help us process our bereavement. Dedicated locations we can visit to keep our memories alive. But for many of us, these things just aren't enough. The pain of fully letting go feels unendurable. Added to which, if we admit the finality of our loved ones, we're implicitly faced with our own finality. In this state of denial, we seek out illusions that offer a promise of perpetuity. On the physical front, there's not much scope for illusions of perpetuity. Corpses reek of finality. In the initial stages, while they still maintain some semblance of the living state, we might just about be able to sustain some fantasies consistent with natural processes. For example, that the person's merely sleeping, but when the decay really kicks in, the evidence of finality is just too uncomfortable. To deny death, we turn to the non-physical, to the realm of symbolic thought. Our capacity for this kind of thinking has led us to entertain a multitude of figurative forms of immortality. Some folks see themselves preserved in their children. Some folks pursue their own individual fame or power as a buffer against extinction. Some devote themselves to influential figures or invest themselves in a group they feel to be emblematic of their own values. Impersonal cultural institutions like the law offer a sense of order and protection, diminishing our awareness of disorder and vulnerability. Architecture, built to span many lifetimes, provides a huge reinforcement of symbolic permanence. But our ultimate psychological alchemy came when we managed to convince ourselves our symbolic self could exist outside our literal self. We called it a soul. Once humans had committed this violation, there was really no end to the possibilities on offer. The soul could be reborn in another body, perhaps another species. It could be reinserted in the same body. It could even simply continue with no body at all. On the face of it, the concept of the independent soul would seem to provide enough denial to keep everyone happy. So why isn't everyone happy? The problem with illusions is that they're devilishly difficult things to maintain. Not only do they constantly run up against reality, they're also vulnerable to competing illusions. Group A denies death with a fantasy in which the soul departs to a paradise or realm of torture after one physical life. Group B denies death with a fantasy in which the soul just keeps getting reincarnated on Earth. When these fantasies meet, there's going to be a clash. The existence of the competing illusion serves as a constant contradiction to the other. undermining its death-denying capability. It soon becomes clear that in order to keep a death-denying illusion going, everyone has to believe the same thing. Over the years, I've noticed a range of strategies to reduce the threat of conflicting ideas. They might simply be dismissed as ridiculous, implausible, maybe primitive. But however much we try to dismiss conflicting ideas psychologically, it's much better if they're just not there at all. History is festooned with aggressive proselytization programs, where one death-denying illusion is displaced by another. Sometimes the poison's sweetened by the addition of medical aid or enhanced educational prospects, supporting the aggressor's delusion that they're helping the savages rather than eliminating the competition. History also abounds with the more violent step up from that, where members of the competing death-denying illusion are exterminated. Where dismissal, proselytization, or murder seem non-viable, we have the truce. Here, parties focus on common aspects between the illusions, while trying to downplay the threatening differences. Some folks have tried this with Christianity and Islam, saying it's the same God. Problem is, it isn't the same God. The God that gave its only Son, in explicit reference to a purported original sin, is not the God that had no such Son. This is not a minor detail that can be discarded. It informs the whole rationale for the belief. And beneath all the magnanimous gestures towards inclusion, multiculturalism, and pluralism, these differences are not forgotten. The inherent supremacism of the individual's ideology merely moves from overt to covert. And when things get rocky, that supremacism is quick to surface. Out come the flags, the icons, and the feverish assertions of monoculture. Truces have an elastic limit. Finding common ground gets harder as differences between groups increase. When confronted with groups who have no divine beliefs at all, it is of course possible to offer a truce based on human values, but that tacitly acknowledges the redundancy of divine beliefs. Hence, strategy number 5, emotional blackmail. Here, folks attempt to coerce those who don't share their illusions into silence by evoking guilt or fear. Sometimes the blackmail is preemptive. The blackmailer lets it be known publicly that they couldn't bear it if anyone confronted their illusions. Other times the blackmail's reactive. The blackmailer tries to stifle any further challenge with the same manipulative methods, casting folks who expose their illusions as cruel, destructive, and heartless, hoping they'll be persuaded to mask their dissent. Whatever the strategy, the goal is the same. Unable to withstand scrutiny or challenge, the poorly constructed illusion can only survive by blocking them out. Having reflected on this death denial over several years, it was intriguing to come across experimental support last year, when my friend Tim introduced me to the work of Sheldon Solomon, Tom Brzezinski, and Jeff Greenberg, the proponents of terror management theory. Sheldon Solomon explains, if culture serves a death-denying function, then if you remind people that they're going to die, that should momentarily increase the need for the death-denying aspects of their particular beliefs about reality. And that should be reflected by their reactions to other individuals, who either bolster or support those beliefs, or who undermine those beliefs by either being hostile to them or merely different from them. The terror management team have conducted scores of studies to investigate this mortality salience hypothesis. In a study into attitudes, 2 groups of Christian subjects were asked to fill out a questionnaire, ostensibly about how people form impressions of others. The questions in one group were specifically phrased to remind the reader of his or her own death. Both groups were then asked for their impressions of 2 fictitious students who shared personality traits. One student was a Christian, the other was Jewish. Subjects who'd been reminded of their own death gave an especially positive assessment of the Christian and an especially negative one of the Jew. The subjects who weren't reminded of their death showed no preference. Another study investigated the effects of mortality salience on behavior, looking at subjects' willingness to use cultural symbols and icons in inappropriate ways. In the first of 2 tasks, subjects were given a variety of objects and asked to sift sand from a jar with water and ink. The American flag was the only object that would do the job. In the second task, subjects had to hang a crucifix on the wall, but in order to do that, they had to use the crucifix to bang the nail in. Subjects who had been reminded of death in a prior questionnaire took twice as long as those who hadn't. The researchers also looked into the effect of mortality salience on subjects' choice of political candidate, using campaign statements expressing 3 different leadership styles. The task-orientated leader's statement emphasized high but achievable goals, implemented through efficient resourcing and delegation. The relationship-orientated leader's statement focused on respect, compassion, trust, communication, and appreciation. The charismatic leader's statement alluded to the nation's greatness and stressed the importance of vision and group identity. Initially, only 4% voted for the charismatic leader, with the remainder fairly evenly split between the other 2. But when subjects were reminded of death, votes for the charismatic leader soared to 33%. Interestingly, votes for the relationship-oriented statement fell sharply. The researchers noted how these results echoed George Bush's rise in popularity around the 9/11 attacks, with his appeals to the nation's greatness and righteous war against the axis of evil. In a subsequent experiment, the researchers found that reminders of both mortality and 9/11 significantly increased support for Bush, not just among conservatives, but also liberals. As the researchers pointed out, we should be extremely concerned at how easy it is to manipulate an electorate's political preferences through appeals to a combination of nationalism and fear. While it's natural to fear legitimate threats, we'd do well to keep some rational perspective and demand facts, rather than allow ourselves to be seduced by heroic, fear-based rhetoric. In this video, I looked at the illusions we construct to deny death, and how they lead to divisive and disproportionate emotional responses to folks who don't share those illusions. In the second video, I'll be exploring several other grave subjects, including the label of pro-mortality atheist, the demands of immortality, the claim that there are no atheists in foxholes, and the possibility of peace of mind without recourse to illusion.